Welcome to True Crime Stories for English Learners, where real-life mysteries meet clear and simple English.
The Self-Help Guru's Secret, NXIVM and Keith Raniere. The brand was small, about the size of a dime, and it was burned into the skin just above the pubic area. The women who received it were told it was a symbol of empowerment, a mark showing they had committed to growth and transformation. They were told the branding ceremony was an honor, a sign they had been chosen for something special. But the brand wasn't a symbol of empowerment. It was Keith Raniere's initials, KR, incorporated into a design that also included the initials of his second-in-command, Allison Mack. The women were being literally branded as property, marked like cattle, in a secret ceremony that involved being held down while a cauterizing pen burned the design into their flesh. They were told not to use anesthesia because the pain was part of the growth process. This was DOS, a secret society within NXIVM, a self-help organization that had operated for over 20 years. To the outside world, NXIVM offered expensive courses promising personal and professional development. But inside, particularly in DOS, women were being systematically manipulated, exploited, branded, and turned into sex slaves for Keith Raniere, the organization's founder and leader, who called himself Vanguard. This is the story of NXIVM, how a convicted con man built a multi-level marketing scheme disguised as personal development, how he created a sex cult within that organization, and how Hollywood actresses, heiresses, and successful professionals were manipulated into becoming his slaves. It's a story about manipulation, abuse of power, and how intelligent people can be gradually indoctrinated into accepting the unacceptable. The making of Vanguard. Keith Allen Raniere was born on August 26, 1960 in Brooklyn, New York. From an early age, Keith claimed to be extraordinarily intelligent, a child prodigy who could speak in full sentences at 1 year old, who taught himself to read at 2, and who had a genius-level IQ. These claims, like much of what Keith said about himself, were exaggerations or outright lies. Keith's mother died when he was 18, which he later described as a traumatic event that shaped his life. He briefly attended Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, studying physics, mathematics, and biology, but didn't complete his degree. Despite his claims of genius, his academic record was unimpressive. In the 1980s, Keith got involved in multi-level marketing, MLM, also known as pyramid schemes. He founded a company called Consumers Byline Inc., which claimed to offer members discounts on various products. In reality, it was a pyramid scheme where people made money primarily by recruiting others, not by selling products. In 1993, 23 states filed lawsuits against Consumers Byline, and Keith was forced to shut it down and pay a fine. Most people who were caught running pyramid schemes would move on to different ventures, but Keith saw an opportunity. He had learned that people would pay money for the promise of success and that he was skilled at manipulating and controlling others. He decided to apply these skills to a new venture, but this time he would market it as personal development rather than a business opportunity. In 1998, Keith co-founded Executive Success Programs, ESP, which would later become known as NXIVM, pronounced NXIVM. His business partner was Nancy Salzman, a nurse and practitioner of neuro-linguistic programming, NLP, a controversial set of techniques claiming to reprogram the mind for success. Nancy became known as prefect within the organization, second in command to Keith, who took the title Vanguard. Building NXIVM. NXIVM marketed itself as a personal and professional development company, offering courses based on something Keith called rational inquiry. The organization promised to help people overcome their limitations, achieve success, and reach their full potential. The entry-level course, called Executive Success Program, cost $2,700 for a 5-day intensive training. The courses used techniques borrowed from various sources, elements of Scientology's methods, NLP, large group awareness training, and Keith's own pseudoscientific theories. Participants engaged in exercises designed to break down emotional barriers, examine limiting beliefs, and commit to growth. The techniques were psychologically intense and designed to make participants feel they were having profound breakthroughs. Keith positioned himself as a genius and guru. He claimed to have one of the world's highest IQs. He said it was 240, though he never provided verified proof. He claimed to be a concert-level pianist, a judo champion, and an expert in multiple fields. Former members have said most of these claims were false or greatly exaggerated, but within NXIVM, they were accepted as fact. The organization grew slowly but steadily. It attracted successful professionals, lawyers, doctors, business owners who were looking for an edge in their careers or seeking personal growth. It also attracted wealthy individuals who could afford the increasingly expensive advanced courses. Some courses cost tens of thousands of dollars. NXIVM was particularly successful in recruiting women. Keith presented himself as a feminist who wanted to empower women. He taught that traditional gender roles were limiting and that women should be strong, independent, and sexually liberated. This message appealed to many women, especially those who felt constrained by societal expectations. But Keith's feminism was a facade. In reality, he was using the organization to gain sexual access to women. He had multiple sexual relationships with NXIVM members, often simultaneously, while preaching that jealousy and possessiveness were negative emotions that needed to be overcome. His followers were taught that having sex with Keith was an honor and a learning experience. By the mid-2000s, NXIVM had centers in multiple cities and had recruited several thousand members over the years. The organization had also attracted some celebrity members, including actresses Kristen Kruk and Allison Mack from the TV show Smallville, and Claire and Sarah Bronfman, heiresses to the Seagram's liquor fortune. The Bronfman sisters became particularly important to NXIVM. They invested over $100 million in Keith's ventures and used their wealth to fund the organization, pay for Keith's lifestyle, and finance legal attacks against critics and former members. Their money allowed NXIVM to grow and gave Keith the resources to silence opposition. The Inner Circle. While NXIVM appeared to be a personal development company to outsiders, it operated quite differently for those in Keith's inner circle. Keith had a harem of women who were all sexually involved with him while believing they had special, unique relationships with him. He manipulated these women using psychological techniques refined over years. Keith would identify women's insecurities and vulnerabilities, then use those against them. He positioned himself as the only person who truly understood them, the only one who could help them grow and reach their potential. He isolated women from family and friends who might question the relationship, teaching that outside criticism came from people who were suppressive and didn't understand NXIVM's advanced concepts. Sex was framed as personal growth work. Keith taught that women had issues with sexuality that needed to be overcome, and that having sex with him, often in ways the women found uncomfortable or degrading, was therapeutic. Women were encouraged to overcome limiting beliefs about monogamy, jealousy, and sexual boundaries. Keith also used what he called exploration of meaning, EM sessions, intense one-on-one conversations where he would verbally break down a person's beliefs and sense of self, then rebuild them according to his desires. These sessions could last hours and left participants emotionally exhausted and psychologically vulnerable. The organization had a ranked structure with colored sashes indicating levels of advancement. Keith wore a purple sash, the highest level. Nancy Salzman wore a green sash. Below them were various levels of coaches and trainers who had completed multiple courses. This hierarchy created status competition and gave Keith control through the ability to promote or demote members. NXIVM also used litigation as a weapon. Keith and the Bronfman sisters would sue former members, critics, and journalists who wrote negatively about the organization. These lawsuits were often baseless but expensive to defend against. The strategy was to bankrupt and intimidate critics into silence. Many former members were too afraid to speak out because they couldn't afford the legal costs. Despite these troubling practices, many NXIVM members genuinely believed they were part of something positive. They had made friends in the organization, felt they were growing and learning, and were committed to Keith's vision of a better world. They didn't see the manipulation because it happened gradually and was framed as personal development. The creation of DOS. In 2015, Keith created DOS, a secret society within NXIVM. DOS stood for Dominus Obsequious Sororium, which translates roughly to Master over Slave Women. Only women were allowed to join DOS, and membership was kept secret even from most NXIVM members. DOS was structured as a pyramid. Keith was at the top. Below him were first-line masters, women who reported directly to Keith. Each first-line master recruited 6 slaves who would be second-line members. Those slaves would eventually recruit their own slaves, creating a pyramid structure. Women were told that DOS was a women's empowerment group designed to help them overcome their limitations. To join DOS, women had to provide collateral, compromising information or materials that could destroy their lives if released. This might include nude photographs, false confessions to crimes, damaging information about family members, or anything else that would create severe consequences if made public. The collateral was supposedly to ensure commitment to the group, but in reality, it was blackmail designed to keep women compliant and silent. DOS members were given assignments by their masters. These assignments often involved extreme calorie restriction. Some women were required to eat only 500 to 800 calories per day, leading to dangerous weight loss. They were required to take cold showers. They were required to get up at 5 a.m. every day to text their master. They were given writing assignments and required to do whatever their master commanded, without question, within seconds. Women were told these assignments were designed to help them overcome their limitations and build discipline. In reality, they were being conditioned to obey without thinking, to accept demands that violated their boundaries, and to subordinate their own judgment to their master's commands. The branding came later. Women were told they would be receiving a small brand as a symbol of their commitment. They weren't told what the design was beforehand, or that it incorporated Keith Raniere's initials. The branding ceremonies were conducted in secret. Women were held down by other DOS members, while one member used a cauterizing pen to burn the design into their skin. The process took 20 to 30 minutes and was excruciatingly painful. After being branded, women were told the brand was a symbol of the elements and feminine strength. Only later did some women realize they had been marked with Keith's initials. They had been literally branded as his property. DOS also served as Keith's personal sex cult. Many DOS members were required to have sex with Keith as an assignment. They were told this was an honor and part of their growth. Some women were required to send him nude photographs. Others were assigned to seduce him. The entire structure was designed to provide Keith with sexual access to women while framing it as empowerment and personal development. Allison Mack's role. One of the most prominent members of DOS was Allison Mack, the actress best known for playing Chloe Sullivan on the TV show Smallville. Allison had joined NXIVM in 2006, drawn by its promises of personal growth and empowerment. She quickly became deeply involved, eventually becoming one of Keith's most devoted followers. Allison was a first-line master in DOS, reporting directly to Keith. Her initials, along with Keith's, were incorporated into the brand that was burned into women's skin. She was one of the primary recruiters for DOS, using her celebrity status and her own belief in Keith to convince other women to join. Allison recruited women into DOS by telling them it was a secret women's empowerment group. She would build trust with potential recruits, often becoming friends with them first. Once they were interested, she would require them to provide collateral before revealing any details about the group. By the time women learned what DOS actually involved, they had already provided compromising materials that could be used against them if they tried to leave. Allison conducted some of the branding ceremonies, operating the cauterizing pen while other women held down the victim. She gave assignments to her slaves that often came directly from Keith. She helped perpetuate the lie that DOS was about female empowerment when it was actually about serving Keith's desires. Former DOS members have described Allison as both a victim and a perpetrator. She was manipulated by Keith and genuinely believed she was helping women grow stronger. But she also actively recruited women into a system that exploited and abused them. She helped brand women with Keith's initials. She pressured women to have sex with Keith. Her victimization by Keith doesn't erase her responsibility for what she did to others. The exposure. NXIVM's downfall began when several members, including some prominent figures in the organization, left and began speaking out. Sarah Edmondson, a longtime NXIVM member and coach in Canada, was one of the first DOS members to publicly reveal what was happening. In 2017, Sarah was recruited into DOS. She provided collateral and began receiving assignments. When she was told she would be branded, she assumed it would be a small, professional-looking mark. Instead, she was held down while a symbol was burned into her skin without anesthesia, taking 20 to 30 minutes of excruciating pain. Afterward, when she realized the brand incorporated Keith's initials, she was horrified. Sarah left NXIVM and contacted journalist Frank Parlato, who had been investigating and writing critically about NXIVM for years. She also spoke to Catherine Oxenberg, an actress and member of European royalty whose daughter India had been recruited into NXIVM and DOS. Catherine had been desperately trying to get her daughter out of the organization. In October 2017, the New York Times published an article exposing DOS and the branding. The article included Sarah Edmondson's testimony and photographs of the brand. The revelation shocked the public. A self-help organization was running a secret sex cult where women were being branded with the leader's initials? The article triggered an FBI investigation. Former members came forward with evidence. They provided copies of documents, photographs, videos, and testimony about what happened inside DOS and NXIVM. The investigators discovered extensive evidence of sex trafficking, forced labor, and other crimes. On March 25, 2018, Keith Raniere was arrested at a luxury villa in Mexico where he had been hiding. He was charged with sex trafficking conspiracy, and conspiracy to commit forced labor. Allison Mack was arrested shortly after and faced similar charges. Nancy Salzman, Claire Bronfman, and several other high-ranking NXIVM members were also indicted. The trial and convictions. Keith Raniere's trial began in May 2019 in federal court in Brooklyn. The prosecution presented testimony from multiple former NXIVM members, including women who had been in DOS. The testimony was graphic and disturbing, revealing the extent of Keith's manipulation and abuse. Witnesses testified about the branding, about being required to have sex with Keith as assignments, about the extreme calorie restriction that left them malnourished and weak, about the collateral that was held over them as blackmail. They described how Keith had sexual relationships with multiple women simultaneously, how he had sex with a 15-year-old girl, how he created the entire duet structure to serve his own desires. The prosecution also presented evidence that Keith had specifically designed DOS to create a system where he could have sex with women while claiming It was their idea and their choice. They showed messages where Keith instructed Allison Mack on how to recruit women, how to obtain collateral, and how to convince women that having sex with him was part of their growth. Keith's defense argued that everything was consensual, that the women who joined DOS knew what they were getting into, and that Keith was being persecuted for having an unconventional lifestyle. They claimed the branding was voluntary and that the women had chosen to participate. The jury didn't buy it. The evidence was overwhelming that Keith had created a system of coercion, manipulation, and blackmail. The collateral insured women felt they couldn't leave. The gradual escalation of demands made it difficult for women to recognize what was happening. The isolation from outside perspectives prevented reality checking. On June 19, 2019, after less than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Keith Raniere guilty on all counts: racketeering, conspiracy, wire fraud conspiracy, forced labor conspiracy, sex trafficking conspiracy, and attempted sex trafficking. He was also found guilty of possessing child pornography, images of a 15-year-old girl he had sexually abused. In October 2020, Keith was sentenced to 120 years in federal prison. The judge said Keith had shown no remorse and remained a danger to society. Several victims gave impact statements at the sentencing, describing how Keith had damaged their lives. Keith maintained his innocence, claiming he had done nothing wrong and that he was being persecuted. Allison Mack pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy charges before trial. In June 2021, she was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. The relatively light sentence reflected her cooperation with investigators and the judge's view that she had been manipulated by Keith, though she had also manipulated others. Allison was released from prison in July 2023 after serving 2 years. Nancy Salzman pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy and was sentenced to 42 months in prison. Claire Bronfman pleaded guilty to conspiracy to conceal and harbor illegal aliens and fraudulent use of identification. She was sentenced to 81 months in prison for her role in NXIVM and for using her wealth to fund Keith's activities and attack his critics. Several other NXIVM members also pleaded guilty to various charges and received prison sentences or probation. The survivors speak. In the aftermath of NXIVM's collapse, several former members have spoken publicly about their experiences. Their stories reveal how difficult it is to recognize manipulation when you're inside it, and how gradual indoctrination can lead people to accept things they never would have accepted initially. India Oxenberg, daughter of actress Catherine Oxenberg, was one of the most deeply involved DOS members. She was Keith's girlfriend, fully committed to the organization and resistant to her mother's attempts to rescue her. After Keith's arrest, India gradually recognized how she had been manipulated. She has since spoken openly about her experience, including in a documentary series called Seduced, Inside the NXIVM Cult. India described how the organization preyed on her desire to make a difference in the world and to be part of something meaningful. She explained how the personal growth language masked what was actually happening, that overcoming limiting beliefs really meant accepting abuse, that commitment to growth meant obeying Keith's sexual demands, that empowerment meant being branded as property. Sarah Edmondson, who had been a senior coach in NXIVM before joining and then exposing DOS, co-hosted a podcast called A Little Bit Culty, where she discusses cult dynamics and interviews other survivors. She has spoken about how she recruited dozens of people into NXIVM before realizing it was harmful, and the guilt she feels about that. Mark Vicente, a filmmaker who joined NXIVM and rose to high ranks before leaving and becoming one of the key whistleblowers, has described how the organization slowly changed from something that seemed positive to something obviously harmful, but the change was so gradual that members didn't recognize it. Former members described similar patterns: initial courses that seemed helpful and positive, gradual commitment of more time and money, isolation from outside relationships and perspectives, increasingly extreme requests framed as personal growth, and eventual recognition that they had been manipulated. Many suffered from PTSD, depression, anxiety, and trust issues after leaving. Understanding NXIVM. How did NXIVM happen? How did a convicted con man convince successful, intelligent people to join what was essentially a pyramid scheme and sex cult? Understanding this requires looking at how manipulation and cult indoctrination work. First, NXIVM started with something appealing. The initial courses offered techniques that many people found helpful. Participants felt they were gaining insights and making breakthroughs. These early positive experiences created commitment and trust that Keith later exploited. Second, the organization used gradual escalation. People weren't asked to join a sex cult on day one. They were first asked to take a self-help course, then more advanced courses, then coaching certification, then membership in various inner circles. Each step seemed reasonable given the previous steps. By the time women were being branded and forced to have sex with Keith, they had been conditioned over years to accept increasingly extreme demands. Third, NXIVM used social proof and authority. When you see successful, educated people vouching for something, you assume it must be legitimate. When Hollywood actresses and wealthy heiresses are members, the organization gains credibility. When everyone around you believes something, it's hard to maintain skepticism. Fourth, the organization isolated members from outside perspectives. NXIVM taught that critics were suppressive and were trying to hold members back from growth. Family members who expressed concerns were labeled as limited and fearful. Members were encouraged to surround themselves primarily with other NXIVM members who reinforced the group's beliefs. Fifth, NXIVM used loaded language and thought-stopping techniques. Special terminology and concepts made it difficult to think critically or express doubts. Questioning was reframed as limiting beliefs or failure to commit to growth. Members learned to police their own thoughts and suppress doubts. Sixth, Keith used individual manipulation techniques with women in his inner circle. He identified vulnerabilities, isolated women from support systems, created dependency, and used intermittent reinforcement, alternating between affection and rejection to create trauma bonding. These are classic abusive relationship dynamics. Finally, the collateral in DOS served as powerful insurance against defection. Once women had provided compromising materials, they felt trapped. Leaving meant risking the release of materials that could destroy their lives and harm their families. This blackmail kept many women compliant even after they recognized they wanted to leave. The broader context, NXIVM is far from the only organization that has used personal development and empowerment language to mask abuse. The self-help industry is largely unregulated, and charismatic leaders can exploit people's desire for growth and meaning. Large group awareness training programs, while not all harmful, can use psychologically coercive techniques that make participants vulnerable to manipulation. The line between legitimate personal development and cult indoctrination can be fuzzy, and organizations can cross that line gradually. NXIVM also exploited the feminist language of empowerment while actually doing the opposite. Keith presented himself as helping women overcome patriarchal conditioning when he was actually conditioning them to serve him. This inversion of feminist principles, using the language of liberation to justify oppression, is particularly insidious. The case also highlights issues with how we think about consent. DOS members technically consented to their treatment, but was it truly informed consent? They were gradually conditioned to accept abuse, blackmailed with collateral, and operating within a distorted reality created by years of manipulation. At what point does coercive control make consent meaningless? The NXIVM case has led to discussions about the need for regulation of personal development organizations, better education about manipulation, techniques, and legal frameworks for addressing coercive control in contexts beyond domestic violence. The legacy, NXIVM's collapse in 2018-2019, was widely covered in media. Several documentaries have examined the organization: The Vow on HBO, Seduced, Inside the NXIVM Cult on Starz, and various other films and series. These documentaries feature interviews with former members and show how gradual indoctrination works. The case has become a cautionary tale about the self-help industry, about how legitimate desires for growth and improvement can be exploited, and about how coercive control can be disguised as empowerment. For the survivors, the legacy is complex. Many have spoken about their experiences to help others recognize manipulation and to prevent similar organizations from harming people. But they also carry trauma from their experiences and guilt about things they did while under Keith's influence. The legal legacy includes convictions and prison sentences for Keith and several high-ranking members. Keith will die in prison. His 120-year sentence ensures that. The Bronfman sisters lost much of their wealth through legal fees and restitution payments. NXIVM as an organization is dead. But the lessons remain important. Charismatic leaders can still exploit people's desire for growth. Manipulation can be gradual and difficult to recognize from inside. Intelligent, successful people can be indoctrinated if the right techniques are used. And organizations that claim to empower people may actually be doing the opposite. Remembering the victims, the women who were harmed by NXIVM and DOS, deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as survivors who found the courage to speak out. Many of these women were accomplished professionals who achieved success in various fields. They weren't weak or stupid, they were normal people who were systematically manipulated. These women were branded, starved, coerced into sex, blackmailed, and psychologically abused while being told they were being empowered and were growing stronger. The cognitive dissonance they experienced, being told one thing while experiencing another, created profound psychological harm. The women who testified at Keith's trial showed remarkable courage. They faced cross-examination designed to shame and discredit them. They had to describe intimate details of abuse publicly. They risked having their collateral exposed. But they did it anyway because they wanted accountability and wanted to prevent Keith from harming others. India Oxenberg, Sarah Edmondson, Mark Vicente, and the other survivors who have spoken publicly have helped people understand how cults work and how anyone can be vulnerable to manipulation. Their willingness to share their stories despite shame and judgment has been educational and valuable. Final thoughts: the NXIVM case is a story about how the language of empowerment can mask exploitation, how personal development can become indoctrination, and how a charismatic leader can build a cult disguised as a business. Keith Raniere was a con man who learned early that people would pay money for the promise of success and self-improvement. He built an organization that started with somewhat legitimate personal development courses, but gradually became more extreme, more controlling, and more abusive. At the center was Keith's desire for power, control, and sexual access to women. The women who were harmed by NXIVM were seeking growth, meaning, and empowerment. They wanted to be better versions of themselves. These are healthy desires, but Keith exploited them. He turned personal growth into a justification for abuse. He framed service to him as self-actualization. He called coercive control overcoming limiting beliefs. The exposure and prosecution of NXIVM was only possible because survivors found the courage to speak out despite the collateral held over them, despite the shame, despite the fear. Their willingness to come forward brought down an organization that had operated for 20 years and a leader who had seemed untouchable due to his wealth and connections. Keith Raniere sits in prison now, still maintaining his innocence, still claiming he did nothing wrong. His followers are gone. His organization is defunct, and his reputation is destroyed. The women he branded and abused are healing, speaking out, and helping others recognize manipulation. The mansion where Keith lived with his harem is empty. The NXIVM centers have closed. The branded initials on women's bodies remain as permanent scars, physical reminders of how they were marked as property by a man who called himself Vanguard and claimed to be helping them grow. The lesson of NXIVM is not to avoid all personal development or to distrust all communities. It's to recognize the warning signs. Leaders who demand absolute obedience, organizations that isolate members from outside perspectives, groups that require increasingly extreme commitments while promising enlightenment or transformation, and any person or organization that frames abuse as growth. Personal growth is valuable. Community is important. But true empowerment comes from maintaining autonomy, thinking critically, and preserving boundaries. Any organization or leader who requires you to give up these things in the name of growth is not helping you evolve. They're helping themselves at your expense. The women of Dos were told they were being empowered as they were branded with their master's initials. They were told they were overcoming limitations as they were starved and coerced into sex. They were told they were part of something special as they were systematically exploited and abused. They were lied to. And now, as survivors, they're telling the truth, not just about NXIVM, but about how manipulation works, how anyone can be vulnerable, and how important it is to maintain critical thinking and healthy skepticism even in the pursuit of growth and transformation. That's the real empowerment, not in following a charismatic leader, but in trusting yourself enough to recognize when something is wrong and having the courage to walk away, even when you've invested years and everything you have. The survivors of NXIVM found that courage, and their stories serve as a warning and a guide for anyone who might encounter the next Keith Raniere in whatever form he appears.
Another dark chapter closed, but the mystery of human nature continues. Thanks for listening to True Crime Stories for English Learners. Don't forget to subscribe and join me next time for another real story that's stranger than fiction.